Now, as we've already indicated, one thing that determines whether your population is an asset or liability is the level of human infrastructure that you have: health, education, housing. Again, if you treat people with respect and people have the ability to make a good life for themselves and have access to modern education systems, modern healthcare, then people are a tremendous asset to build a vibrant state with tremendous power. So the quality of that human infrastructure is an indicator of a country's power. Powerful countries have very healthy and rich human infrastructure. Poor countries that are weak tend to have very fragile, narrowly based human infrastructure. Another key asset is the capital infrastructure. What do the ports and airports and railroads and highway systems look like? Are they functioning? Are the roads and bridges in well repair? Can you move people and goods cheaply from one end of the country to the next? Can you export goods from your country relatively inexpensively? Can you import goods into your country in efficient ways? Does your power grid work in a reliable way? Is your communication grid functioning? These are all key ingredients to enable a state to transform its human and natural resources into power. Countries that lack this capital infrastructure, again, tend to be poor, weak states that cannot transform their human or natural resources into national power. So we mentioned natural resources. This is another key ingredient. This is a picture of an open pit gold mine. That always helps a country. And so natural resources are not distributed evenly. We live in a world of finite resources that have been distributed unequally around the world. Some countries have more than others. Some countries have critical natural resources than others. So, for example, oil, gold, diamonds, quality agricultural land, a river system that enables water consumption and also transportation of goods to market. These are all key ingredients to national power that can't really be altered. It sort of, a country is dealt their hand when it comes to natural resources. But once we factor in the other indicators of capital infrastructure and human infrastructure, then that lets you know whether a country is able to translate their natural resources into power. Another factor is internal cohesion. This looks at the morale of a country, the legitimacy of the government, the unity of its people. Is there a country that is divided into factions that are constantly ripping each other apart? Or is the society fairly unified behind the regime that's in power? A unified regime has much more bandwidth. It's able to engage in activities abroad with more freedom, where a country that is facing internal strife, lots of internal criticism, that has less bandwidth. It's not able to maneuver as freely or engage in as many initiatives abroad because of the intense criticism and struggles they're having at home. This is a picture of a pro-government rally, which is an indicator that these citizens support their governments against whatever critics are charging the government. So internal cohesion is a factor in state power. Regime type is another key indicator that helps determine whether a state is able to translate its inherent capacity into actual capacity. There's quite a bit of evidence that shows that democracies tend to be more wealthy than non-democracies, even controlling for natural resource dispersion or population levels. On the other hand, authoritarian governments are often able to manipulate the extraction of resources to protect itself in order to build up its support, or also to funnel that money into other instruments of power. For example, North Korea, if you look at it objectively, it has a very inefficient government, it has a communist regime, it has probably sufficient natural resources, but is unable to translate that into wealth or power, particularly when it comes to food production. The North Koreans are repeatedly racked by famine, and yet it's able to, because it's a communist system, find the resources and accumulate the resources to maintain a very powerful military and indeed a nuclear weapons program that objectively it can't really afford. So regime type is a key factor here. Democracies tend to be better than autocracies, and also democracies tend not to fight each other, which helps build their relative power as well. Speaking of democracies not fighting one another, alliances is another indicator of power. Basically, countries with friends feel more powerful and usually are more powerful than countries without friends. This is one reason why diplomatic isolation is an effective tactic in diplomacy, to create a coalition of countries that are on your side who will object to and oppose the policies of another country, even though those battles are fought in the negotiating room of perhaps the United Nations. It's significant because a country that is isolated is not able to pursue its national interest in those venues, where countries that have lots of friends are able to pursue their national interests in those venues. So this is a slide of NATO headquarters, which is an example of a very strong, robust alliance that augments the power of its members. Another indicator of power that is more subjective is culture. There are some who argue that issues like a work ethic affects a country's power. So this is a picture of the Civilian Conservation Corps, of people in the 1930s who were building national parks, and in this picture putting up fences, work that was not particularly meaningful, but it was to them because they needed to be able to work, to feel good about themselves. That idea of a work ethic helps build the power of the country. Whereas if you have a culture that doesn't value hard work, if a culture values blaming others for your failures, then that culture is not going to be as vibrant, because it's easier to blame people than work to find solutions to your problems. So this is a somewhat controversial indicator, because not everybody agrees that culture matters. They argue that more concrete factors like the military strength or natural resources or the human infrastructure have much more impact on a country's power. But there's a significant subfield in political science that argues that culture is what drives everything else. So there's a debate in the field, but let's go ahead and put it on the list as something that can have an impact on a state's power. There are many factors that go into a state's power, but the last one I want to talk about in this lecture is nuclear capacity. And that's both peaceful and military applications. To have a peaceful nuclear weapons program is an indicator of modernity, that if you have nuclear power plants, everybody knows you're a modern country. So there are many countries, even developing countries, that pursue nuclear power as an option for the status that it bestows, as much as for the actual energy that the state may get from it. But the main thing we want to look at here is nuclear weapons. Ever since the end of World War II, and during the Cold War, possessing a nuclear weapon is seen as the key to great power status. Countries that have nuclear weapons are automatically seen as major players because of the tremendous damage they can do. Countries that do not have nuclear weapons tend to rely on other aspects of power to compensate for that. So Japan and Germany, for example, will use their economic prowess to have the seat at the table. But they may be seated across from Russia, who has a smaller economy than Brazil, and yet Russia continues to be invited to these meetings. Why is that? Well, you could argue the only reason Russia gets invited to these meetings is out of politeness, because Russia has nuclear weapons, and it used to be a major power. And so we continue to invite them, even though their economy is quite small. So that's an indication of the status that nuclear weapons bestow. So other countries seek that status. This is why nuclear non-proliferation is a continuous issue in our modern world, as countries that seek to become regional powers do so by threatening to or developing a nuclear weapon as a way to leapfrog their competitors to become seen as a major player. So these are some of the factors that go into whether a country is powerful or not. Now, no one of these factors is going to make a country powerful. It's a combination of the factors. If you have a vibrant democracy with a great educational system, but you're a city-state like Singapore with no natural resources to speak of and a very tiny population, that may be a good country to live in, but that's not a country that's going to be a major global power. On the other hand, you might have a country like Brazil, who has all of the ingredients here for a major power, but is only now, within the last 15 years or so, being able to bring those ingredients together to be able to assert itself as a global power. And we could look at China or India as other examples of countries that have all of these ingredients and yet don't quite have everything that it needs to be a superpower. And that's because of their weaknesses. Their human infrastructure is weak. Their capital infrastructure for India tends to be weak. China's building things like crazy. They're building like 20 airports a year. So China's addressing their capital infrastructure problem. But the point is that just having some of these ingredients doesn't make you powerful. It's the way they're put together and the way they're exercised, the way these resources are brought to bear on others and also on their own people is what distinguishes a powerful country from not a powerful country. Now, in our next lecture, we'll look at the types of power and how we can rank order countries on power. But this is the determinants of power, the ingredients of what make countries powerful or not. This lecture was provided courtesy of Dr. Brian Dilley. That's me. I'm a professor of political science at Mesa Community College.